So I wanted to give you a little bit of information about project stakeholder management. Okay, so project stakeholder management is defined by the Project Management Institute as describing the processes required to identify people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project, to analyze the stakeholder expectations and their impact on the project, and to develop appropriate management strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. Okay, and that's taken right from your PMBOK. So I just wanted to quickly go over this, chart which is in the PMBOK, and it again, hopefully you've seen this before, but it basically talks about the different process groups as well as the knowledge areas and shows you all of the different exact activities defined in each process group and also by knowledge area. So if you ever do take the PMP, this is an essential chart to memorize. You need to know every single thing on there. So but that's kind of how the PMBOK again breaks it down. When we study project management, we look at it in different process groups. We also look at it by different knowledge areas, and you need to understand that this is by no means any of these activities in here are by no means in any sort of chronological order. They happen all simultaneously for the most part. Obviously, planning comes before executing and that kind of thing. As far as the knowledge areas, many of them can occur simultaneously. So the project stakeholder management knowledge area, it's concerned with identifying all the relevant stakeholders, as we mentioned, and assessing their needs. So careful attention in this knowledge area is paid to managing conflicting interests among stakeholders, and this knowledge area ensures that stakeholders are informed and educated on the progress of the project. So there's four processes that cross four of the process groups in the knowledge area. Obviously, the initiating, you're going to have identify stakeholders. In the planning process group, you'll have plan stakeholder management. In the executing process group, you'll have manage stakeholder engagement. And in the monitoring and controlling process group, you'll have control stakeholder engagement. This is a new knowledge area. So most of the content used to be included in the communications knowledge area, but when they updated the PMBOK, this became the newest knowledge area. While the formal organizational structure tells us how individuals or groups within an organization should relate to one another, it doesn't tell us how they actually do. That's why we want to study this a little bit more closely. So the informal organization here then is what you would find that's not on the organizational chart, right? It bypasses the formal lines of authority. Power then is determined by how well one is connected. It can be more complex than the formal organization because relationships are established from positive and negative, and they occur over time, and they change. So it's very complex. Obviously, we've talked about stakeholders enough in this course. We should know this, but we need to make sure that we have a clear definition of stakeholders. And it's individuals, groups, or even outside organizations that have a stake or a claim in the project's successful or unsuccessful outcome. So some of the things that the identify stakeholders process does is it creates an important output called the stakeholder register. And really the stakeholder register contributes to defining the project. So early identification of the stakeholders is one of the keys to success in executing projects. Stakeholder identification is also an important part of the process of developing the requirements. So missing stakeholders, in other words, leads to missing requirements because you don't have everybody at the table. So the consequences of missing requirements we all understand at this point, and it's often cited in the literature. We have disappointed, users, or problems with passing acceptance testing, or having to rework, many things. So it helps with scope definition. It prevents costly changes later on, and determining stakeholders' expectations and keeping them positive by getting them involved early, right? So, in other words, if you involve stakeholders early in the process, they're going to be more willing to cooperate and actively participate down the road and throughout the remainder of the project. And that's going to, in turn, improve buy-in to the process, to the project, and to the proposed solutions. So, and a key thing to understand though is remember that not all stakeholders are positive. A stakeholder is anyone who is affected or involved or affected, right, by the project in any way, positively or negatively. So, and the other thing to understand is the identify stakeholders. It's an ongoing process. So I mentioned it's part of the process of developing requirements for the project, but it's going to continue to occur throughout the entire duration of the project because new stakeholders will be added as we go. Some of the inputs here then, the project charter will help with the description of the project, and it can help identify stakeholders that way. Some of the procurement documents might be able to provide information on stakeholders, contractors, subcontractors, EEFs, what's your organizational culture? That might help you identify stakeholders. Organizational process assets would potentially have a template, stakeholder register. And then in the stakeholder analysis, part of the tools and techniques here, stakeholders will be asked about their communication needs and preferences. Then they're going to be assessed in terms of their influence and salience or power on the project. Your communications with them will then take place according to what that analysis does. And a little bit more, some of the classification models used for the stakeholder analysis, we're looking at the power interest, power influence, influence impact, or the salience model. Here you see the power interest grid, right? And you can classify your stakeholders as high power or high interest up here in the right quadrant, and those you're going to want to manage very closely, right? You can classify them in high power low interest, or low power high interest, or low power low interest, right? So those are the 4 different quadrants, and it may suggest different approaches on how you deal with stakeholders. Minimum effort in the low, or manage closely monitored and informed. So really this just kind of represents recommended communication strategies. Make sure you don't put stakeholders where they should be when you're doing this, or where you would like them to be. This should be done in collaboration with the project manager or with another person in order to keep it as subjective as possible. This type of information on a project is not meant to be distributed, so it's kind of sensitive information. So you want to keep it with your project documents and keep it confidential. Some of the advantages of using a model like this, it can help to discover where the real power over a project is located. It helps you find the right communication means with different stakeholders. There are also disadvantages to this type of a model. It can be subjective, as I mentioned. It's got to be performed on a regular basis because things change. So it's not you just do it once and that's it. And it doesn't show the stakeholder's attitude, so you don't know if they're a positive or a negative stakeholder. Power influence, very similar model, right? Other models, the other ones they're basically the same. It's a quadrant type of model. You usually just use one, but you could certainly use them differently. And you want to make sure that you define your terms carefully, right? So power interest, power influence, or influence and impact on the project. Those are typical ones that I've seen. So here's another example I found of another matrix with some adaptations, right? And so you can see how these can be varied based on your needs of the project that you're working on, but it's the same basic idea. Okay, so the salience model, this is another tool to classify stakeholders, and it's called the salience model. It's really like a Venn diagram. It creates 8 areas here. So we've got 1 through 8. You'll see the numbers there. 8 is a non-stakeholder in this particular classification. So the stakeholder salience is decided by assessing their power, legitimacy, and their urgency. So power in this case is defined as the ability of the stakeholder to impose their will on a project. Urgency then is their need for immediate action, okay? And legitimacy is whether their involvement is appropriate. So the model lets the project manager decide the relative salience of a given stakeholder, and basically what it does is it tells them the degree to which managers should give priority to competing stakeholders' claims or their suggestions, or just their perspective. So out of the 7 classifications, the dormant stakeholder, right, has power. So number 1 here, the dormant stakeholder has power, but not urgency or legitimacy. Okay? So therefore, the manager here should be aware of them, but there's no need to plan for their communication needs. So number 2, the discretionary stakeholder has legitimacy, but no power and no urgency. So their communication needs might be in the form of actually asking for details, and they don't need attention all the time from the project manager either. So 3, these are kind of demanding stakeholders, right? And they have urgency, and their needs have to be met when asked for. Okay? So the classes that need close attention are dominant, dangerous, and dependent. So 4, 5, and 6, where more than one of the dimensions overlap, right? 4 is where power and legitimacy overlap, and they're classified as dominant. So they have a legitimate claim on your time, and their communication needs have to be taken into account. 5, the dangerous stakeholder, is where power and urgency overlap, right? And so with that combination, they could actually be dangerous to your project's welfare unless their demands are met, right? Because you've got to act, and they've got power. 6 is where urgency and legitimacy overlap, and that's the dependent stakeholder. So they should be kept informed, right? They could be of help to you because they have a legitimate stake in the project. So they could be of help to you when you need to leverage their legitimacy and the urgency that they can get from the organization as a whole. So the most important class then obviously are those stakeholders who are classified as a 7, and that's the definitive stakeholders. And you need to meet this group's every need, as really they're crucial to your project because they've got the legitimacy, they've got the urgency to get things done, they also have the power. Their needs need to be responded to right away. Okay, so that's kind of the salience model. So to kind of sum up the process, the main goal then is to identify stakeholders so they can help define the project. So this process needs to occur at least early in the project, and obviously multiple iterations throughout the project. Again, negative stakeholders influences need to be managed closely. A stakeholder management strategy will help guide effective communications. Stakeholders should be identified early and should be kept informed throughout the project. Okay, so the next process group is the planning process group, and the point of planned stakeholder management is really to identify how the project will affect stakeholders, which then allows the project manager to develop various ways to effectively engage stakeholders in the project. It also allows them to manage their expectations and to ultimately achieve the project's objectives. So stakeholder management is more than improving communications, it's more than managing a team. Okay? And it's also about creation and maintenance of relationships between the project team and the project stakeholders. So, and the aim here really is to satisfy stakeholders' needs and requirements, but within the project's scope, budget, schedule, and the triple constraints. So this process generates the stakeholder management plan, right? The stakeholder register, and the Stakeholder Management Plan, and that really contains detailed plans for effective stakeholder management. One of the keys to understanding why this process is important is as the project progresses, the membership of the stakeholder community may change, right? So, but also the required level of engagement of individual stakeholders may change throughout the course of a project. So that's a key point in understanding this. So therefore, then, stakeholder management planning is an iterative process, as we mentioned, and it's reviewed on a regular basis by the project manager. In other words, the main output of this process is a detailed plan for how to effectively manage the stakeholders. The goal is to effectively maintain positive relationships between the stakeholders and the project team. It identifies how the stakeholders will be affected by the project, and it identifies the current and desired levels of engagement with the different stakeholders. Your primary input here is your stakeholder register, which will help plan how to engage with stakeholders. And your tools and techniques, expert judgment, used to determine appropriate level of stakeholder engagement. Analysis is used to determine current engagement levels and the required engagement levels. Engagement levels, to speak of, unaware, those stakeholders are unaware of the project and its potential impacts. They could be resistant, which means that they're aware of the project and its potential impacts, but they're also resistant to change. They could be neutral, meaning that they're aware, but neither supportive nor resistant. They could be supportive, meaning they're aware and they're supportive to change. And they could also be leading, which means that they're aware of the project. They're also actively engaged in ensuring the success of it. Okay. So how do we use the classifications that we just talked about, unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, and leading? Well, we put them into a stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. C on the chart here for stakeholder 1 represents their current engagement level. So in this example, stakeholder 1 is currently unaware of the project. But D represents our desired engagement level for the stakeholder, so we would want them to be in a supportive role. In this example also, stakeholder 3 is at the desired engagement level, and stakeholders 1 and 2 are not, so they require further communications from us, additional actions to move them from their current to the desired level of engagement. Okay, so the output then is the stakeholder management plan, which again contains our agreed upon strategies for engaging stakeholders. Remember, the plan contains potentially sensitive information and distribution should be carefully controlled. So what does the stakeholder management plan contain? Well, here's an example template. Here's a table of contents of a stakeholder management plan. Project sponsor, stakeholder management approach, our identification, which includes a register, power interest grid, strategies, manage closely, keep satisfied, keep informed, monitor, etc. Control their engagement and any attachment. So the executing process group then. So this process makes sure stakeholders, especially negative ones, are kept up to date and well informed of the progress of the project. Active management can increase support and minimize resistance from stakeholders, and it decreases the risk of the project not meeting its goals. Okay. The inputs here, the stakeholder management plan tells us how we'll manage the stakeholders. Again, the communications management plan includes the stakeholder communication requirements. The change log here, items there are, and their impact must be communicated to the appropriate stakeholders. So anytime there's a change, you've got to communicate that. Of course, any changes and their impacts are documented across the project as well. The organizational process assets here, issues management, change control procedures, historical information, those types of things. Tools and techniques. Stakeholders will have communicated preferred methods of communication with you. Interpersonal skills include trust building and conflict resolution and listening. Your management skills here would include facilitation techniques, negotiation, influencing. those types of things. Okay, so some of the outputs, the issue log that may come out of stakeholder management activities. Change requests might be needed for the project. Plan for managing stakeholders could be a change request. Project management plan updates. So really, to summarize this process of the managed stakeholder engagement, it's really a straightforward process. It's proactive management of the stakeholders is the key here. Resolving stakeholder issues before they impact the project goals. You want to focus on keeping stakeholders happy and supportive of the project, and issues and conflicts need to be documented, and continuous management of stakeholders throughout the project needs to take place. Control stakeholder engagement. In this process, you are evaluating the overall health of stakeholder relationships and adjusting the engagement plan as needed. So the inputs here, project management plan is going to contain details including techniques for stakeholder communications. The issue log is updated as new issues are identified. Work performance data is part of every monitoring and controlling process except for integration. So the tools and techniques here, information management systems, that's the tool to capture, store, and distribute information to stakeholders. The outputs here, work performance information, that's going to be based on analyses that you perform. Change requests here may result because progress reports come out. You've got to make some changes to either crash the project or something like that. Maybe the scope needs to be altered, whatever it is, because the project's behind schedule. Really, a summary of the control stakeholder engagement. It's very straightforward as well. Main goal here is to ensure that stakeholder relationships are in alignment with the plan. So the project manager uses the plan to assess and evaluate the relationships with the stakeholders and their ongoing influence on the project. So like the other monitoring and controlling processes in other knowledge areas, work performance data goes in and work performance information comes out. So data is an input, information is the output.